Today's show is brought to you by Reflection Bay Golf Club, located in the heart of beautiful Lake Las Vegas. Go to reflectionbaygolf.com. That's reflectionbaygolf.com. It's a top 100 course the public can play. It's a Jack Nicklaus Prestige signature design that played host to the Wendy's 3-Tour Challenge from 1998 to 2007. I'm Tommy Canale, and welcome to Before the Lights podcast. This show to find out how those in sports, music, and entertainment made their mark. Go get your coffee or grab a drink, because today on the show, we have a New Orleans native. He served in the United States Marines from 1979 to 1983. He joined the United States Army National Guard and the Air National Guard, retired after 25 years. He's a fourth generation as his great-grandparents arrived in the United States in the 1800s. His family is known for their restaurants. He is the author of the newly released Food for Kings book about Diamond Jim Moran, a New Orleans legend who we're going to talk about today on the show. Please welcome his grandson, Booby Brocato Jr. Bobby, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, Tommy, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be on your show. Thank you.
When I say this word, what comes to your mind? Food.
Italian.
Where did your passion for food and cooking come from?
Ever since, well, you got to realize all the men in my family are cooks. And my dad taught me how to cook at a very young age. And once I was old enough, around 12 years old, during the summertime, instead of running the streets, my dad got me in the restaurant working for my uncles, because my uncles took over the restaurant after my grandfather died. And they carried on the tradition of La Louisiane and some other famous restaurants in New Orleans that we can talk about later, that basically I worked in the kitchen until I was about 17. So it was kind of bred into me, you know.
What kind of jobs did you have at the restaurants? Were you cook, dishwasher, prep? What were you doing?
Yeah, I mean, basically starting off cleaning dishes, that's where you start off at, and then, making salads, and then, progressing to, rolling meatballs or whatever he needed me to do. I even bust tables, just kind of worked all over. And one of my main things I did was my uncle was, he was one of the first to have fresh pasta in New Orleans. And they went to Rome, him and his brother, and they went and bought some pasta machines, brought them back, and they were known for their fettuccine, their fresh pasta in New Orleans. So I made a lot of the homemade pasta in the restaurant as well.
You were an aircraft mechanic for American Airlines for 20 years, and then for Delta as a lead mechanic. Did that come from the time that you served with the United States Marines?
No, sir. When I got out of the Marine Corps, I wasn't in aviation. I was just grunt basically. And then when I got out of the Marine Corps, I went to the Army and got into aviation there. And then once I got out of the Army, then I got in with the airlines in the late 80s. So I worked for United for a year, and then American, and I currently work for Delta.
How demanding is that job?
It's pretty demanding because you got a lot on the line, I mean, if the plane's not safe, then you could run into a lot of problems,
For sure.
So, yeah.
How big of a checklist do you guys have before you say plane's good to go?
I mean, all your checks are done at nighttime, but unless there's something wrong, basically you just make sure it's got oil, kick the tires, and keep it going during the day, and then at nighttime is when all the maintenance is done. So it's a routine maintenance procedure schedule that's done for all the aircraft, You
wrote a book that you were kind enough to send me called Food for Kings that is available on Amazon, and I'll put a link to the show notes. It's Food for Kings about Diamond Jim Moran, who's a New Orleans legend. First off, why write the book?
Well, a lot of my motivation came from my father, because my father, his whole life, he wanted to, because of his relationship with his father, basically they were so close together. They were like brothers. So my father practiced dentistry for years, and for 40 years, but he always wanted to do a movie, but he never did actually finalize anything. So after he died, I got together with my brother and I, and then later my sister. But what I did first is I wrote a screenplay, which I kind of did it backwards. I should have wrote the book first, then a screenplay, because after I did the screenplay, anybody in that business, they know it's very difficult to get it out there and get someone to put eyes on it, you know? So a little time went by, and then I got with my brother, my sister, my mother, and I said, let's all get together. Let's tell a story about a grandfather, but let's tell it in a way where we're intertwining food, photos, and stories to where, as you're reading it, you're kind of getting 3 in 1. So my book's not really a recipe. It's not really a recipe book, and I wouldn't really call it a memoir, you know? So it's kind of a combination of all 3. So it's really a neat way to tell a story while you're cooking, I guess, you know?
I took a look at it. I have the color edition, and if you're going to buy the book, buy the color edition. You'll be thankful you did, because the recipes jump off the page to you. And as Bobby said, it is a combo. It's a memoir, it's a biography, it's a cookbook. And as you're reading it, you want to start learning more about the recipes. Then you get to the recipe section. And then if you're like me, you start marking what you want to make. The story's about Diamond Jim Brocato Moran, and we'll explain the transformation of the name here. A restaurateur in New Orleans in the 40s and 50s. He was a Sicilian immigrant, lived in the French Quarter, started out as a shoe shiner at age 7. And Bobby, if you would kind of take it from there on explaining why at age 7, all of a sudden your grandfather is shining shoes in the French Quarter.
Well, at that time, early 1900s, he had lost his father to the yellow fever epidemic, which is kind of like a pandemic we're going through now on a smaller scale, which was in New Orleans. So he was led. He was a man of the house, where he had to support his mother, and he had a brother and a sister, and he had to get out on the streets of the French Quarter and hustle. He had to figure it out, and he actually dropped out of school. I think 3rd grade, and started shining shoes and just trying to make money. And the story goes, at that time he had a dream that he wanted to wear diamonds, and he bought his first diamond at the age of 8 years old for $5. And that beginning of when he bought that diamond basically set the pace for where he was going to go in his life. He had a dream, and he was going to stay with it. So he continued on to do that, and then he started getting into boxing. And you got to realize the French Quarter back then was basically like a little Italy. It was mostly all Italians. They you know, and his circle of friends was Pal Moran, another guy by the name of Pete Herman, who were also Italians, but also changed their name to an Irish name because back then it was easier. The Italians were kind of looked down upon, and they knew when they started boxing, if they had an Irish name, you know, or different than an Italian name, you know, it would be easier for them to be put on the card of boxing because it would draw a bigger crowd. And then also, my grandfather didn't want his mother to know that he was fighting, so that's when he changed his name to Moran from Brocato. But all 3 of those guys were Italians, and then they grew up, you know, living together in New Orleans. And then later he got into refereeing when he got a little older. And then, you know, his body kind of gave out a little bit. He started refereeing. And then he after that, then he went into he opened up a speakeasy. And then in 1949, he opened up his first restaurant, was called Jimmy Moran.
Yeah, let me back up there. What kind of prize fighter was your grandfather?
He didn't really get into big fights like a lot of his the guys that he hung around with. Pete Herman was the bantamweight champion, and then Pal Moran, he had quite a few fights too, but he really didn't go to the level those guys did. But he did dabble in it a little bit, and then actually his the guy that he went in a partnership with his barbershop was Martin Burke, and he was also a big fighter too. So once he got out of the boxing, then that's when he kind of got into refereeing. You know.
Do you know about how long he was a prize fighter?
It was about 6 years.
Okay. All right.
About 6 years.
So he goes from being a fighter, then he goes into being a referee. And how long was he a referee?
About 6 years.
Okay. So he spent about a dozen years of his life in prize fighting, between fighting and refereeing.
Right. There was, let me interrupt you for a second. There was actually an incident where he was refereeing his friend's fight, Pal Moran, and they had a reporter that said, "Hey, what are you doing refereeing this fight? Don't y'all both have the same last name? Are y'all related?" He goes, No, we're not related at all. You know, so there's an article in the book that I had put it in there. I don't know if you found that article. Yeah.
The question I want to talk to you, and I'm going to jump here a little bit.
No
There was a Louisiana politician by the name of Huey Long, and your grandfather was in his entourage.
Yeah.
And he allegedly saved him from being assassinated from a tip that he got from a connected friend. Is that correct?
Okay, so that was around 1933, and there was an attempt. And Costello was it was actually my grandfather Costello that actually got the tip off and basically headed off. It was supposed to happen in a French Quarter, and this is also in the deposition of. It's not just me just saying this. It's in a deposition that my dad had put together in 1977 with witnesses that I think you had listened to. And so that kind of kicked off. I want to kind of transfer. That's kind of the beginning of what happened, because basically my grandfather, he surrounded himself first politically, and then he went into the mafia. And basically what it was Huey, Robert Maestri, who was an Italian mayor of New Orleans for approximately 10 years, and then Seymour Weiss, who actually owned the Fairmont Hotel, or actually the Roosevelt back then. It switched names back and forth, the Roosevelt. And by him circling himself around those guys politically, he was kind of the liaison between mafia and the politicians to be able to make things happen. So after that attempt on Huey, basically, Huey had known about what Costello wanted to do by bringing the slot machines into New Orleans, and he got with my grandfather and said, "Hey, let's get all those guys together. We'll go down to Paso Lucha, which is down by the mouth of the river at the hunting camp, where it's private, and let's put this thing together where we can start getting the slot machines from New York to New Orleans, because that's what Costello wanted to do."
Talking about Frank Costello for our listeners. Yeah,
Frank Costello. I'm sorry. And so the ball got rolling, and then unfortunately, what happened, as everybody knows, or most everybody knows, Huey got assassinated 2 years later. So, but you had the ball rolling, having things in motion to where now the slot machines were coming. But my grandfather still had Robert Maestri in his back pocket, because he was the mayor of New Orleans, and he was the mayor for 10 years. As a matter of fact, they were so close. My grandfather named my dad after him. My dad is Robert Maestri, and I'm actually Robert Maestri too. I'm junior. So that's how close they were. So if you name somebody after your son, you got to admit you're pretty close, right? Yeah,
for sure.
So that's what actually got the ball rolling, and then those guys started coming in, and then Carlos Marcello, started to get in the picture. But you got to realize Carlos Marcello was actually on the West Bank. And the way New Orleans was kind of set up, it was very regional as far as, we go by parishes down here, right? So Costello and Castell had Orleans Parish, and Marcello had the West Bank, which is Jefferson Parish. So everyone kind of stayed in their own territory, and everything kind of worked out just fine for a while. It went on for about 10 years, but another mayor came in the picture. They were getting a lot of political flack from the public about ending gambling. And the next mayor in line was Chet Morrison. And, when there's a new sheriff in town, basically things started getting shaken up. And when Chet Morrison came in, I think it was 1947, when he came in the office, basically he started running everybody out of Orleans Parish, ran Costello out of Orleans Parish, and they even found a warehouse full of slot machines and destroyed a bunch of them. And but what they did, it's like hitting an ant pile. They just dispersed and then went to the outer parishes, So because he could only control Orleans Parish and not Jefferson and the surrounding parishes around New Orleans.
In 1930, the Ming Toy Night Club,
yes, sir,
was raided, and your grandfather was sentenced to 1 year in prison for violation of the Volstead Act, which is the National Prohibition Act.
Yes,
only served about 6-7 months. If you would talk about that process of what you know about the raid and getting out of prison.
I like to start there because basically, when I was dissecting my grandfather's life, I really wanted to know, did he meet this guy first or this guy first? So like I mentioned before, he had met the politicians first, and where they met at, there was 3 places that they could meet at. It was either the Italian Club, which was a big place on Esplanade, where a lot of Italians hung out, the NOAC, the New Orleans Athletic Club, which was strictly a men's club, upper elite men's club, where all the businessmen and Italians would meet, and then the Roosevelt Hotel, which was owned by Seymour Weiss. And my grandfather's speakeasy was just right across the street from the Roosevelt Hotel on Barone and Common, which is around the corner, if you're familiar with New Orleans. And I can't prove it, but I think that's how my grandfather met in the 20s. That's how he met Huey Long, was through Seymour Weiss. And one particular night, Huey was, as mentioned in a deposition that my dad had put out, Huey was in there and they were trying to get a lot of dirt on. At the time, he was a senator too. They were trying to get a lot of dirt on Huey. They got a tip off, and basically they forced a raid in there. And fortunately for Huey, he was able to get out the back door and escape. And unfortunately, my grandfather had to take the rap for the alcohol that was in the place. They sentenced him to 1 year in Atlanta federal penitentiary, and then he got out on supposedly good behavior, but I think Huey was pulling some strings from Baton Rouge to get him out early, because he got out 3 days before Christmas, 1933, I believe.
Touch base that he was getting into some speakeasies with Costello, and also wasn't some of the other mob people tied, like Meyer Lansky and
Right.
Lucky Luciano, also tied to those speakeasies with your grandfather?
Yeah, supposedly, but I can never pull up any documentation, so I don't really like to go down as far as the relationships that he had with them. But I know that he did, based on what my dad told me. But I couldn't find any direct correlation with them. Now during the Kefauver, we can get into the Kefauver hearing if you want a little bit later. But during the Kefauver hearing, of course, they were trying to connect my grandfather with all those guys. If you go through that whole deposition, all the minutes of the Kefauver hearing, it's quite lengthy, and there was a lot of people involved, as you know.
So, and here's the question I have, even reading the book and all the stuff you sent me, and what I knew before that, was your grandfather really tied to the mob, or was he just friends with guys that were connected to the mob?
That's a good question, because I wouldn't say he was tied to the mob, like married to different mafia families and stuff like that. He was a 100% Italian guy that knew New Orleans. You got to realize he never traveled outside of the 4 corners of the French Quarter. That was his domain. And when people came to New Orleans, he had one of the finest restaurants in New Orleans. They would come to his place. But you got to realize, keep things in perspective, that my grandfather didn't open up his first restaurant until 1949. So all the information that's in my book and all the stuff that I'm talking about, all those relationships, you got to realize they were all done before then. So where would he have met him? In the speakeasy and places like that.
And speaking of friends, I mean, he was friends with some big time names when you go through his life. Marilyn Monroe, Jack Dempsey, Rocky Marciano, Joe DiMaggio, horse racing jockeys. And I'm going to get into horse racing in a little bit. What do you know about I'm sure boxing was the relationship between Rocky Marciano and Jack Dempsey, but he was really close with Rocky Marciano.
Yeah, he was exceptionally close with him. He even always referred certain dishes that Rocky used to like when he used to come in the restaurant. And I really couldn't find, many more articles about them doing things together. I know he did a lot with Jack Dempsey outside. He went to Miami to go visit with Jack Dempsey when he had a fight down there and stuff like that. And, New Orleans was a big boxing town. There was a lot of big fights. If you do your research, I'm not sure if Rocky Marciano fought in New Orleans, but if you look at that one particular photo where Rocky is driving my grandfather's Corvette, which was actually the first Corvette that ever came into New Orleans. If you look closely, you can see stitches above his eye where he had just had a fight, So that's how close it was. So even after a fight, he would get together with my grandfather. And my grandfather was a big hunter, a big duck hunter, and he would bring a lot of people to his camp to go duck hunting. So they might have even did some duck hunting together.
Now I want to get into, he's known as Diamond Jim Moran. We're going to talk about the diamond infatuation. You mentioned he purchased his first diamond at a young age for $5. What is the collection worth these days, and what's in it?
Well, I did. There's an article where he had one reporter had asked him a question: how many diamonds do you have on your person? He said it's about 425 diamonds. Now, I'm not talking about individual set inside of but I had done the math, and it was like almost $2 million in today's worth of what he walked around every day. There's an article in the book. A reporter had asked him a question. He says, "Aren't you scared of walking around the French Quarter carrying all those diamonds?" And he goes, and he opened up his coat. He goes, "Not when I'm carrying this 45 Colt, And he always, if you're familiar with the 45, there's a couple safeties on it, and he would have the hammer pulled back. The only thing he had to do was squeeze the pistol grip and pull the trigger. So he never got messed with.
This diamond collection, I mean, he had eyeglasses, and he had the grill that you see nowadays in celebrities wear. I mean, he was doing that back in those days.
Oh yeah. Actually, I like telling the story about about how he acquired different, his glasses and this and that. But the one thing that's in my book, or the article I found where, because I wanted to know where did he come up with the idea to put diamonds in his teeth? Today that's not bizarre, right? But back in the 50s, like there's no one, he was probably the first one to ever do it. So there was a guy in Houston by the name of Doug Prince, who actually was good friends with my grandfather. And he had sent a message to my grandfather saying, look, he knew my grandfather was infatuated with diamonds. He goes, look, I one-upped you. I got me a diamond toothpick. And my grandfather thought for a second. He goes, okay, let me think about this one for a little bit. And then that's where he got the idea of the diamond teeth, where basically you would snap it in like a bridge, and it would go all over the front of his teeth. And he sent a picture of him with the diamonds in his teeth. He sent it back to Doug Prince. He goes, what do you think about this? He goes, next time you ought to think about messing with the wrong person when you want to put on a challenge,
From 1928 to 1958, he never missed a Kentucky Derby. And from my understanding, wasn't he asked or paid to show up with as many diamonds as possible?
Yeah, he was like a spectacle. It'd be like if you wanted to invite, the King of England over or something, to come over just so you could draw a crowd. And he got paid $50,000 to attend one particular Kentucky Derby. I'm not sure what year it was, but when he came, he was in full bloom. I have many articles in the book about different reporters writing about him when he was at the Derby and asking him questions. And there's an article in there that actually says the that the track steward was getting upset with him because he would draw such a big crowd, and people weren't going to the window to put in wages, and instead they were asking for autographs because my grandfather thought he was a movie star, and that's all he would do. He would just sign pictures of himself or programs with his autograph. You know.
We talked about it briefly, but in January of 51, he was called before the Senate Kefauver's Crime Investigative Committee. He served as an ambassador of goodwill for slot machines, which was ran by Costello. Bobby, what do you know about him being called and what transpired in that hearing?
Well, they called him in as a witness. He wasn't the main character by any means. Matter of fact, I went through the whole minutes of the hearing. I went through it. It's real long. And I found in there where they quoted him. Basically, they just had a couple questions for him, and they asked him, you know, what association do you have with Costello? And he says, "Look, he's a good friend of mine." He goes, "Look, I'm just a businessman that has a restaurant, and I put diamonds inside of a meatball, you know, and people love my food." And he even told Kefauver, he says, "And if you want, next time you're in New Orleans, please come down to my restaurant and I'll make sure I take care of you and feed you," you know. But I like to back up a little bit. When he was going into the courthouse, his attorney had said, "Look, it's probably not a good idea for you to put all those diamonds on because you're going to look too, you know, flamboyant. You know, you might want to, you know, tone it down a little bit." And my grandfather turned to him and he says, "Is the media going to be there? Is it going to be publicized? Is it going to be on TV?" He says, "Yeah, absolutely." He goes, "Well, then the ice stays." Because that's one thing he wanted to do. He wanted to show off. No matter if there was more limelight, he wanted to kick it up a notch.
Also in 51, explain the reasoning behind the horse name Booby Brocato.
There was a guy by the name of Joe and Dorothy Brown. They were from Texas. They had moved to New Orleans. They were oil tycoons. And basically, Joe bought the Horseshoe Casino in Vegas. I'm not sure which it was on 128 Fremont.
It's on Fremont Street, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not familiar with what's there now, but he owned the Horseshoe Casino. He actually bought it from Benny Binion, who was in trouble with the IRS, and basically he was in trouble, and Joe had went ahead and bought it from him, and so. My grandfather and Joe were very good friends. And when my dad was coming up, he was around the Browns a lot. And he named the horse Booby Brocato after my father, which won some big races. Won the New Orleans Handicap, won the Santa Anita 1 year. I think it was 56, I'm not sure. And so they was so close a relationship, they named the horse after him. And then also Joe Brown, after he got out of Vegas, he actually had a big influence in New Orleans. He was also, along with Costello, a lot of people don't know, along with Costello, he was actually one of the big owners of gambling houses and casinos around the New Orleans area for about 10 years.
And that horse was the grandson of Man o' War, which, right, if you know anything about sports or horse racing, you've heard of that horse, Man o' War.
Right, right.
We touched on this before. Your grandfather's wife lost her diamond ring while making meatballs. A female client bit into the meatball, found it, didn't swallow it, tried to return it, and your grandfather said, "Nah, go ahead and keep it." And then goes out to the store and starts buying more rings to keep the tradition going. Like a light bulb came on for a marketing idea. First off, right, how long did this tradition go on, and how many rings were they placing in meatballs randomly?
That's a good question, because that was the one thing when I put my book together that I really, as I put this book together, I had questions in my head, not so much for the reader, but for myself, that I wanted to know, you know, when did he get this idea? When was it conceived? And why did he do it? You know? And I found the first article in 1949, after that incident where my grandmother had lost the ring and the meatball. He had set up an advertisement in the paper saying on this particular day, he was going to give away a diamond ring, and he was going to put it in a meatball. And then the next day, of course, it ran in the paper. The winners in the book. Actually, I put a couple winners in there. And he started that from 1949 to 1958 to his death. And I also found an article where a reporter had said, well, not a reporter, but he had advertised in the paper saying he was going to give away 2 1-carat diamond rings for that week. Now, if you just do the math and say for 10 years, he gave, let's just say he gave one away a month. You know, that's a lot of diamonds.
A lot of diamonds.
And each one was a carat.
That's an expensive meatball.
Yeah. and actually, that's how my mom and dad met. One of my premier recipes in the book is the diamond studded meatball, which is on the menu. And that's how my mom and dad met. When my mom went to New Orleans, my mom's from Dallas, Fort Worth. And when she came there, her mother and father were good friends with my grandfather. When they came there, my grandfather had set up and put a diamond in one of the meatballs. And then that kind of led to the marriage and engagement of my mother and father.
I can only imagine the excitement of somebody going, just found me a carat diamond ring in my meatball. Yeah. There's nothing going on like that these days.
No. And that's the whole thing about my grandfather's life. Every time he did something, he did it to the extreme where nobody had ever done it before, you know? And he was always one step ahead of everybody, that whatever he was doing.
What I want to do here, Bobby, is I'm going to go through the list of restaurants that your family was known for. There's different ones. And I'd like to know if you could just kind of tell me, is the building still there? Are they closed? Is it demolished? And what was that restaurant known for? Okay. And the first one I want to start out with is La Louisiane.
Okay. La Louisiane is a long history. Originally in the late 1800s, it was actually a home of, I think it was a French family. And then there was a couple people before my uncle that actually tried to turn it into a restaurant. And then in 1954, because you got to realize my uncle had a restaurant before that. His was on 809 St. Louis, which was called Jimmy Moran's. And he actually owned both of them at the same time. So when he opened up La Louisiane, then shortly after that, he closed down the other restaurant. And then when he died in 58, my uncles took it over, and they kept it until the late 90s. And currently today, it's actually a bar. They turned it into a bar.
And were both those restaurants Italian food?
Yes, both of them. If you look at the menu, that's what I did also. I blew the menus up and I put them in the book so you can see the prices, what kind of dishes. They weren't all Italian. He had red beans and rice, and he had, gumbo and stuff like that. So it was a combination of Italian and, New Orleans cuisine as well.
Moran's Riverside, was that your family, uncles? Who owned that? Okay. Was that Italian restaurant as well?
Yes, sir. So after my grandfather died, my Uncle Tony and my Uncle Jimmy, because my father was a dentist, he kind of went off in the dentistry. And those two guys got together. They carried on the tradition of La Louisiane. And then my Uncle Jimmy opened up Moran's Riverside, which was, if you're familiar with New Orleans, it's right off of Decatur Street, right on the river, overlooking the Mississippi River on the Riverwalk, not too far from Cafe Du Monde. Everybody knows that, Jackson Square. And he carried that on. He opened that in 77, and then he carried that on until about 10 years. And then there was a restaurant or two behind him, and I'm not sure what's there now.
And what about Absinthe House Bar?
Absinthe House Bar, my Uncle Tony had bought. That particular building has tons of history in it. Supposedly, it's where the Treaty of the Battle of New Orleans was actually signed, up on the second, third floor. And my uncle bought the bar first. It's one of the oldest bars in the French Quarter. Anybody that goes to New Orleans knows the Absent House Bar. It's on Bienville Street in Bourbon. And he opened up that bar in the early 60s. And then later on, he opened up a restaurant right above it called Pasta Vino. And he had that until maybe like 10 years ago. Before his death, he had sold it. He died in 08, right after my father died. So after my uncles had got out of the restaurant business, they basically sold it. So no one currently in my family has any of the restaurants, my generation was.
And the last one I want to ask you about is the Acme Oyster House.
Yes. My Uncle Tony and my Uncle Jimmy actually owned that at the same time they owned La Louisiane. I actually started working there when I was like 15 years old, making po' boys and shucking oysters and stuff like that. And it was directly across the street from La Louisiane. And my uncle sold it. And actually the people that own it today actually turned it to a franchise. There's probably currently maybe 5 or 6 locations around the area.
Last question for you, Bobby, is you mentioned your father passed away in 2008 and he was into dentistry and pretty much wasn't involved in the whole restaurant thing, but very close to your grandfather.
Yes.
Is he the one that kind of influenced you to learn more about your grandfather because he was so close to him? And were you learning as a young child about your grandfather, which I'm sure most families do, from your dad?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because it's a combination of 2 things. It's one, I saw the passion in my dad to want to put a story together, to memorialize his life. But to be honest with you, I fell in love with the story. Forget about he's my grandfather. I was intrigued about my grandfather's life, how he can grow up from poverty, no education, and then eventually, becoming this celebrity star legend in New Orleans and rubbing elbows with the elite and the biggest people of his time. Usually, today's world, everyone looks at how much education you got, and you can't associate with this person or that person because you don't have the education. He had no education, but the one thing he had was self-esteem and drive to compete with anybody. He wasn't intimidated about how good education he had or nothing like that. It didn't bother him. So I was infatuated with the story, which motivated and drove me to put the story together and put it on paper. And then secondly, to do it for my father as well,
The book is called Food for Kings, Diamond Jim, a New Orleans legend. You can get the color edition. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. You can also get it off of Amazon if you don't want to go to the show notes. But please give it a look and support Bobby and all his endeavors. He's put a lot of time and effort into it. You won't be sorry you purchased the book. If anything, you're going to get some great recipes out of it. Bobby, thanks so much for being on the show today, man. I appreciate it. This has been fun.
Okay. Thank you, Tommy. Appreciate it.
Go to our Instagram page, Before the Lights Podcast, and follow us there. Show notes will be on the website, beforethelightspod.com. Thank you for listening to Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Canale. Until next time, everybody, a salute, a chin chin.